Hey, I'm here with Susanna Carman. I've actually been really excited about this conversation for a couple of reasons. One is just the sheer, like almost uncanny similarities in terms of some of our interests that we, have, whether that's, quantum social theory or integral theory or design thinking or, the list goes on. So I think it's just cool to talk with someone who can geek out on so many of the same subjects. And then also your background, Susanna, is interesting to me because, you've got training in music, you've got training in geophysical science, you've got training in counseling, education, design thinking, so you have a really broad and diverse background, but I know that you've drilled pretty deep on a number of topics. And, you strike me as the kind of person that is, from all of these various touch points, really formulating something that's unique that you're offering to the world. And I'm curious about that. You also strike me as someone who is more than just a little bit committed and interested in developing leaders for this, moment in the evolution of our species, or whatever this moment is that we're in on the planet. And that's very near and dear to my heart as well. So I know you're running something currently called which I understand has been very successful and very interesting, called the Transition Leadership Lab. So what is that? Tell us about the lab and what the heck is transition leadership?
Great question. And like an emerging response, right, in this conversation, but also, through my practice and the work I'm doing. So I guess I'll say that Transition Leadership Lab is a 9-week learning lab for design, leadership, and change practitioners who already have a sophisticated set of tools and mindsets, but still feel these are insufficient to lead wisely in the current moment, to lead amidst increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous conditions, to lead amidst the eco-social crisis that we're facing on the planet and the planet is facing with us. So it's really for those leaders who are already committed also to their own development, and they know they need access to more of themselves. There's like a whole embodied intelligence that transcends and includes what they're already working with, both in their toolkit, cognitively, emotionally, creatively. So it's just about creating that safe space for those practitioners who are already leading change processes, basically, to come together, to learn from each other. Also people who understand that transformational learning happens in relationship. It's a relational thing. It happens with others. And I guess I could say I kind of have this belief right now. So in terms of my intent behind the lab, I have a belief that the world needs more leaders who have access to mature, nuanced, and embodied intelligences, so that they can respond more wisely to the current situation. And so I'm making an assumption that if I invest in that in myself and create spaces where others can invest in that in themselves with each other, then perhaps we're growing our capacity in the direction to meet the challenge.
Okay, and so you said embodied, mature, and nuance. Is that the 3 adjectives you used?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you unpack that a little bit? Like, I don't know. Where would you go with that? How does that actually look?
That's a great question. So I guess, there's what's backgrounded in my thinking, and then there's what's foregrounded in my speech. So you're landing on the language that I'm selecting there. But in the background are all, is sort of like a transdisciplinary epistemology and ontology that's like informing what I want to foreground, which is praxis, which is translating theory into action, which is transforming knowledge creation into practical application. And so, when I talk about nuanced, I'm talking about both and orientations to problem seeking and problem solving as like a benchmark standard,
Okay.
sort of depolarized ways of thinking, keeping in mind that polarities are necessary. Through polarity, eros and creativity is born. And this idea that a non-dual way of perceiving self and others is better than, I think you're already lost in the, you've already biased one dual polarity over the other, right? So
performative contradiction.
Right. But just that people, or as leaders, we're investing in building that sort of both end capacity. The capacity to see the interdependency of as reality, and I'm kind of leaning into that sort of quantum world of entanglement, things that are in relationship with each other in ways we can't even see and may never see.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm talking about maturity, I guess I'm leaning into more the Loevinger, Erickson, Bill Torbert, Hilary Bradbury line of adult developmental theory that's around, what I would call that maturity. There's something around ego structure and identity that is matured, sophisticated, a capacity to see the logic behind our own logic and still take action, still take timely action. The capacity to, and I guess this would be leaning more into that sort of Snowden, Cynefin space, like really see the context and the conditions you're operating in and then responding accordingly. Mm-hmm. And noticing bias, noticing the shadow that occludes our ability to see as much as we possibly can in the moment. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'm talking about the embodiment piece is that all this work is happening and all this capacity is available to us from the head up and the neck down, and that there's intelligences in ourselves as individuals and in the spaces between us and in the systems that we're participating in. Mm-hmm. That I guess that we can process, understand, integrate cognitively, but also we could be working with the whole soma, the whole intelligence of what's happening across our somatic experience and through the body. So mm-hmm. all the information, all the signals that we can be accessing that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a really great answer to a very short question. So thank you so much. It really just shows the depth and thought that is behind your work.
Yeah, I might add something to that too, because a lot of people talk about embodiment mm-hmm. or meditative practice or states of experience where you're accessing all of the fullness of ourselves. And then they forget to sort of understand that happens when our nervous system is regulated. So this is where we start to kind of see the intersection between the good intent of adult development and the good intent of, engaging and enlivening our full capacity, and then the impact of trauma and the sort of parts of ourselves that we have no control over that affects how present, available we can be in each moment. And so just making sure that piece is incorporated into the work many of us are doing around the world in a practical way, I think is really important. It gets kind of not spiritually bypassed, but developmentally bypassed sometimes. So
mm-hmm, definitely. So why something that I was curious about, and I think I have an answer. I've been thinking about this. I think I know what it is, but why the word transitions leadership? What is that?
Yeah, that is really great. So I guess what I can say is, firstly, that the Transition Leadership Lab was the output of 3 years of master's research. Mm-hmm. So whilst I'm taking people through a transition process from what to what, from the inside out, would be my definition of transition. The process itself is an experiment that's unfolding that, is of my design, and I am inside the crucible of the design. So this idea of transition leadership is something that has emerged through my own research, is something that I'm testing and experimenting with, is something about both, as I said, moving from what to what in one's own interiority and towards what we want to action in the world, but also during a really liminal moment when things are in flux. I mean, things are always in flux. One could argue things are always liminal, but I think we can demarcate this moment in time as transitioning potentially from one dominant way of perceiving reality and how we measure and understand and relate to that reality to another one, sort of what gets talked about in that developmental space is moving from a rational age to sort of a post-rational age. And so, we're in this moment of flux, uncertainty, erratic volatility. There's a lot going on, and those of us alive right now might not live to the other side of this deeply bridging moment in the big meta picture of deep time and history. So it's basically looking at this transition within ourselves as a fractal of what we want to do in the world, but also understanding that it's happening within the context of, what Zach Stein also always talks about as a time between worlds, where we're trying to make these transitions in ourselves in service to something bigger at a time when everything's up in the air. So the things that we thought were luxuries about nuance, maturity, and embodiment are now, in my view, necessities. So how do we bring those forward as we move from what to what, from the inside out, in this topsy-turvy moment that we're in right now?
Yeah, one of the, I'd like to get to talk to, I think what the meat of this conversation will be, which is the movement from theory to praxis, or how do they fit together. But one of the questions I have that's been on my mind a lot lately is just the sheer absurdity of thinking that most of our theories are useful in this moment between worlds. I have questions about that, because there's you use the word VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and then there's a new one now. I don't know if you've heard this one, Bini, which is brittle, anxiety-inducing, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And so in a world like that, where the maps that we've relied on, where the compasses that we've relied on, where the theories in use of our daily lives, are probably way more inadequate than we even know. I don't even know what the question is to ask, but it's like, how do you act in an environment like that? Yeah. What do you have to say about that?
Well, yeah, in that sort of big macro picture, and I've also heard, Zach Stein talk about this, and I've heard others talk about this, is this, it can go either way. We're on a knife's edge, right? Like we could fall forward, if you think about it in a linear way, or we could fall back in terms of our maturity, our nuance, our embodiment, and our overall development as a collective humanity. And I agree. So just as an example, I live in the Northern Rivers part of New South Wales in Australia, and we've just in the last, since 2019, New South Wales has experienced fires and floods. We've just been through a flood period here, where two flooding events in 1 month exceeded anything that this part of Australia has seen since the 70s, and could possibly have, is predicting what's to come. And the devastation that has produced. I live on high ground. My home hasn't been directly impacted by flood waters, but living in a community that's impacted, living in a community where this sort of notion of climate refugees, domestic climate refugees, is a reality. There are thousands of displaced people right now who can't insure their homes, who can't afford to insure their homes, who are stuck in homes where they own mortgages, but the value of the property isn't worth anything anymore. So and they can't live in them so it's very complex, it's very challenging. And I totally have this experience of there's no space in volatile conditions for probing first, as Knevin would suggest. You have to move into action first, and that's the first piece, and then sort of nudge conditions towards something that you can maybe interpret as complex and adaptive, and then start to bring this sort of relational toolkit into the domain. But yeah, I would agree. We don't know what's going to come. I mean, all we, I guess, can count on is who do we want to be? What has the preparation we've invested in ourselves, in our communities? What is the result of that moving forward? How do we want to show up? How do we want to lead ourselves with others in those moments? And not just, both at the big picture level, the planning level, but also in the day-to-day, working as a volunteer in a local community neighborhood center. What I could see was it was so chaotic that I was up against my own edge of being able to respond to the needs in the moment. And so what was I going to do in that moment to become more flexible, without just going with the flow, while still being strategic and tactical, but also in the moment needing to be flexible. So how do I deal with those contradictions in myself first, so that I can bring some kind of regulation and stability to chaotic systems and kind of help nudge them back in another direction?
Yeah,
I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, it does. What do you do? What is your transition leadership practice, or how does it actually show up in your life, in your daily life?
I was thinking about this because, of course, the lab itself introduces theory, introduces ways of actioning that theory. And I'll just make that distinction. Practice is like, as a musician, you practice repeatedly to develop skills so you have a level of mastery. So your body can just do what it needs to do without you thinking about it. And then you can be expressed through that. Whereas praxis is really translating something conceptual into something pragmatic, actioning an idea. And so in the lab itself, we do introduce different theories and ideas, and then we kind of, at the granular level, introduce things that people can practice out in the world after we introduce them. But for myself, when I'm thinking about this, I guess I also have to think about, with praxis, we do so many things. We do so many things in our day-to-day that's based on constructs and ideas that aren't visible to us. So I would say the first step is like spending a little bit of time starting to notice the connection between what we do and what's constructed in our thinking that informs that doing, that isn't even something that came from me. It's something I got born into, or something that was influenced in how I was educated or the environment I was in. So really kind of spending that time, if you have it, if you have the luxury of that time, to really investigate the epistemology behind, like that source of knowledge that's informing everything I do, and sort of deconstructing that. But then reconstructing that with like, how might I challenge that? How might I question that? How might I do something differently? And I think that works both like in my parenting, like in that sort of mundane, in my relating, with my life partner, but also in my actual design practice. So what are they telling me to do? What do I think is the right thing to do? And then what am I actually going to build and test around that? So Transition Leadership Lab was an outcome of me testing my thinking around, what is the best way to enhance reflexivity, the ability to make visible that which we cannot see about ourselves, the spaces between us, the systems we participate in. What is the best way to enhance that for people leading design and change processes? What are people saying, and what actually works? So the lab does test some of that and tweaks as we go. But yeah, I'm doing that every day in my relationship with the people around me and with myself. What does it mean to actually be deeply compassionate for myself? What does it mean to create space for myself? What does it mean to go slow as I'm aging, as I'm moving into middle age and having to let go of things and embrace new ways of being? what psychological material is occluding, that I can't see as occluding my ability to shift, change, re-identify with a whole new sort of ego structure. So my life is a constant state of action inquiry, of challenging my constructs, testing new constructs, adapting, keeping what works, letting go of what doesn't. What drives that, I guess, is a deeper intent around having my life contribute to the alleviation of needless suffering, including my own. So I'm like, what does alleviate that in a sustainable way at the individual level, at the collective level, at the level of systems and structures? So yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but that's my very practical, personal approach.
I'm curious what you've discovered since you began this work. I mean, I know it's a common, it's almost a continuation of things that have led to this, but since you started the lab, what have you discovered?
Yeah. So one of the things I've discovered is this piece around transformation happens with, it's relational.
Mm-hmm.
So, I am kind of an introvert myself. And so I like to retreat back into my own personal inquiry. What else can I say about that? Yeah, it's quite a driver for me. I like to just be in my own zone. But as uncomfortable as it can be, relating with others is the doorway into understanding ourselves and understanding what's possible. And I think Dan Siegel talks about this. He's got this sort of triangle model around mind, body, consciousness. And, he often talks about relationships as the doorway through which information flows in and out, the information that then is sort of regulated by our nervous systems and made meaning of through our mind. So yeah, I guess that's part of my learning. When we're together, it happens in relationship. Transformational learning happens in relationship. Mm-hmm. The other thing I've discovered is that, like, everyone, even within disciplines, they're all like elbowing each other, particularly in academia. People that you think wouldn't be like, it's like, really, that's not what you're talking about when you talk about maturity. So I'm like, how do we build shared ontology where all these disciplines, this sort of, Wilberian transcend and include thing can sort of come to life in reality? How do we pull on all these different threads in the fabric of life that maybe we can't see how they all stream together, but we know they're there? How do we start to pull on them and then create something new where everyone understands each other? Everyone's, maybe that's a bit kumbaya, but yeah, I guess I feel like this commitment to a shared ontology and the impact that really makes on forward action, even if that forward action is we're just going to be kind and caring hospice workers as we hold each other moving forward. Mm-hmm. And I guess the last one would be around.
Hang on, I don't want to.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to check. You said hospice workers. Is that like a metaphor for, the collapse of civilization, or did you actually mean? What do you mean there?
Yeah, I meant as a metaphor, as an archetypal distinction, right? Some people are luminaries, and some people are like trailblazers. And I think those who tend to poo-poo the frontline support, both practically and metaphorically, that just show up with kindness, compassion, and care. And if in the end, that's all that's available to us, who would you rather be if you had the choice? So yeah, even if that, again, it's kind of like a contradiction. It's hopeful when perhaps there might not be something to be hopeful about, perhaps not in our lifetime. But I'm an optimistic pessimist. Like, I'm not a total Debbie Downer here. I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful because of what I just said, because in the end, I always have that choice, and I can see when I'm making that choice in each moment, and my attention's really on that. Who do I want to be for myself, for others, for the planet, for the systems I'm participating in. You know, sometimes I think about it like, you know, am I a yes? You know, I meet the world with yes and yes. Am I a and maybe and no? You know, I know where I naturally orient to, but what do I want to be when, and who do I want to be when it really matters?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, you know, and I want to get back to that third discovery, but I just want to share a little bit, you know, because you talked about trauma, you talked about the sort of the parts of ourselves that withdraw from our awareness, from our consciousness, as, you know, being the parts that often, you know, get in the way of us being able to see reality and maybe being able to act in a embodied, nuanced, you know, mature way. And, you know, I noticed this happening to me far more than I noticed myself having any capacity to do anything about it. You know, so for example, one of the things that that has just been really, that's come up for me a couple times lately is someone will give me an invitation. Someone will say, do you want to come to this thing? Would you like to be in the room when I'm doing this? Something like that. And this will be someone that I have, you know, great admiration for, really a lot of love for, want to be around them. And in that moment when they say, hey, do you want to come? The first thing that will happen is, without much awareness on my part, and before I have any control over it at all, my body will contract. And then I'll say, oh, sure. And it'll almost sound like a question, like, sure. Like, it's almost like I'm saying, I'd love to come, but only if you want me to. And I know you don't really anyway. So, so I have to ask it like in a very like passive questioning way, because I'm so afraid of being rejected. But all I'll say is sure. And what I leave that person with is, he's not really that interested. And they don't see everything that's going on with me. So they think, oh, I wish Justin was more interested in what I'm doing. But, you know, he's this kind of, you know, nerdy guy that everyone thinks is really smart. So he's probably just not interested. And that's what I leave people with. And so in that kind of behavior that probably comes from some kind of trauma that I'm doing to sort of protect myself, I'm actually creating the world that I'm afraid of, if that makes any sense. And so, so I just wonder, like, what gives people some kind of power or access to having something to say about that, something to do about that in the moment when it's happening? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, there's a few different ways I can respond to that. So
Yeah.
from like an Aikido point of view, not that I'm an Aikido specialist, but the idea that you get thrown off your center in the moment. It's not like you should never get thrown off your center. It's that when you do, how will you, you know, how do you move then? How do you respond then? How do you come back to center? What's your pathway back to, you know, in Aikido, maybe they'd say center, maybe in, you know, trauma-informed psychotherapy, they'd say, you know, or somatic experiencing therapy, they'd say back to regulation. How do you, you know, bring ease and calm back to your nervous system? So it's not that you should never get thrown. It's, you know, what muscles have you been building outside of the moments that trigger reactivity, so that you can notice what's arising in you in that moment, and you can find your way back to center or regulation. You know, that's one way of thinking about it. Another way would be like, you know, like a musician.
Yeah.
Again, back to the distinction between praxis and practice. It's like you practice, so that when you're thrown, you've trained yourself to come back to center, you know, in a timely way. And I don't think there's a silver bullet around that. I think it takes both the initial intent and commitment. Like, what is your intent for yourself and the world around you? And then what is your attention on? So how quickly after you get thrown, because that's where your attention is, and this is sort of Bill Torbert's triple loop learning kind of thing I'm drawing from.
Mhm.
What is your intent, and then what is your attention on in the first person?
Mm.
So that when you get thrown, you're like, okay, I notice what's arising me. I'm aware and in relationship with this experience. I feel this. I'm having this sensation. This is what this means. You know,
Mhm.
what do I need right now? So being in that regular, what do I need for myself? What do I need to do for others? How do I repair? How do I restore? So you're moving into that inquiry as soon as you get the trigger experience. And, you know, again, when we talk about trauma, it's, you know, there's big T trauma, and then there's what we call little t trauma or developmental trauma. And depending on the severity of the core experience, people have different capacity to make object what's arising in them and to move back to regulation. So it is a bit of a spectrum of what we have available to us. And yes, but from, I guess, sort of transpersonal developmental perspective, you know, where are you investing your time and energy outside of those trigger moments so that when you are in them, you're ready to respond. So I
Mhm.
hope that's making sense.
It does, yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. And um, I think one of the things that's really even helpful is to just make like just talking about it with
Mm,
other people seems to
mm.
loosen it up just a little bit. And it gives me some perspective on, hey, I think what I would actually really love to say in a moment like that is uh yeah, I would love to come. Sign me up. I'm in. And
Right, right.
and just maybe even mentally rehearsing that, I don't know, it sort of makes explicit a broader range of possibilities than and once it's made explicit, I think it's more likely to be present in that moment when there's some kind of, body contraction, some kind of fear or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and Justin, you have a lot of capacity already. So you would be someone, I'm making an assumption here, who could go, all right, I'm going to do a counterintuitive test for the next, whatever, 20 days. Every time I get that feeling, I'm going to do what is counterintuitive, what feels wrong. Because
Mhm.
I'm guessing you have done enough work in this space around yourself to trust your own boundaries, and to know when you're safe to lean in. I'm making that big assumption. If you're someone who doesn't know that, then it's really, and there's a variety of reasons. So I'm being slightly vague here, but there's, as I said, a spectrum of experience that creates dysregulation, from severe trauma
Mhm.
and mental health concerns to less severe experiences.
Mhm.
And so my response would be different. I'm just trying to be very mindful of not just putting a blanket answer here. But yeah, if you have already done a little bit of work in this dimension, you can set up some testable safe to fail experiments to see what would happen, and kind of test your competing commitment around that, and see what starts to shift. When I've done somatic or embodiment work in this domain, in that sort of psychotherapeutic space, sometimes just being in relationship with the core assumption in a different way through the
Mhm.
body just shifts me. And then people start relating to me differently without me actually doing something different. So,
Mhm.
that's a really interesting phenomena as well. And then when you're getting into that sort of intersubjective space, which creates more complexity, it's like really starting to notice power patterns or trigger patterns or different people's attachment patterns, and starting to pay attention to what's arising can be really helpful. It's like getting the mind on side. I guess the key to all of that is the first step is learning how to return to center or self-regulate or create ease or resource the self.
Mhm.
That's the first. Without that capacity, it's very difficult to be able to show up um, in non-reactive ways, or in ways where you have your sort of full awareness on what's arising between people. Like sometimes if we're not investing in that, we might actually be contributing to making things worse. Even if we are investing in that, we might be contributing to making things worse. But it's a good starting point, you know, and it's not something you can jump over. You need to sort of learn that skill first.
Mm. Oh, beautiful. Okay, third discovery.
I don't even remember what the third discovery was.
Oh, all right. Okay, well, no problem. Let me ask on behalf of some of the Huddle audience.
Mm.
A lot of these folks are skewed to founders and entrepreneurs, people who are getting things done in the world. I think they appreciate this kind of discourse, but you know, a lot of them are like really interested in how it's going to help them get better results, make them a, you know, more effective leader, things like that. So, you know, how would you make that connection for them?
Yeah, that's really great. You know, that's a great inquiry. I am myself a pragmatist, as I've said earlier, sort of a late 20th century idealist meets pragmatist. And, you know, firstly, I would kind of refer to Donella Meadows, you know, around, you know, key leverage points in complex systems or adaptive systems. And this piece around transforming our beingness, our mindset, the way we make meaning of what's going on around us is one of the highest, if not the most, you know, profound leverage point we can access in order to create transformation. So if you're committed to transformational change,
Mm-hmm.
it's a great place to start. And I can see the allure of going into action or having a bias for action over this sort of interior developmental work. And I think it's, again, it's just a polarity that needs skillful management.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would say the way to translate whether some of what we've been talking about is applicable is to test things, is to try things, is to, like we just discussed, if there's something in you, Justin, that is closing yourself off from opportunity by saying no or signaling no when you mean yes, how
Mm-hmm.
can you do some safe to fail experiments? How can you do some resourcing inside yourself before you get on the call and just prep yourself to say yes, even when you want to say no, when it's safe, you know, when it's relatively safe to do it. So it's about coming up with little, and this is very designerly, like what are some testable experiments you can do in the world that reflect your thinking, and be willing to fail and learn from them and see, you know, this sounds a bit cliche, but to see every failure as an opportunity to learn something new about what's happening inside of us, what's happening, you know, it's all a signal. So if we're staying genuinely curious, or after we get through the reactive moment and we return to a regulated state through which genuine curiosity can flow, what can we be discovering all the time about how I could be applying what I'm learning to my daily relationship? And I guess a lot of the work we're doing is about, you know, human interaction and services that have to do with human interactions from that human-centered design perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I've named three things. It's like that highest leverage point is actually how we're our own logic and making our own logic object to ourselves, and then bringing that awareness into the collective field, and then testing and experimenting with new things and seeing what happens, seeing what works and seeing what doesn't.
Yeah. What about the things that haven't worked? I mean, if you've run a lot of experiments, where have been the face plants? Where have you learned from that it was like, oh, that we won't do that the same way next time?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So of course I can answer that from, you know, my personal life at the scale of the individual. I can answer that in, you know, in terms of the spaces I've been in. Well, let me answer that in terms of Transition Leadership Lab, which is
Sure.
this lab I've created. Is, you know, one flop is this idea that I'm building towards something, that everyone who comes through the lab is going to become part of a community. And whilst that is true, and there is a network building, a sense of shared understanding, supporting each other professionally. That is emerging. I had this thing like, and so what else am I going to do? What else am I going to create for people? Where am I going to bring people next? Like, as though I had control over that, as though people weren't coming through this program as fully developed adults who had their own agency, who could come out and go, this is what I've learned. Now I'm going to go off and do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so one flop was putting a lot of energy into trying to create the next thing. Oh, you know, we're gonna create an action learning group, or I'm gonna get this Slack community working, or I have to create a retreat, and so a lot of my energy got put into, it's my responsibility to hold everybody and take them to what's next, rather than, you know, I have a role to play in that because I've been the node that's connected everybody, but this is an emergent system with people in it, and they, you know, if I'm facilitating the flow of connectivity, is that enough? So I would say some of the flops have just been around my own ego, thinking that I'm responsible for everything and I have to do more, when really sometimes it's just about getting out of the way and midwifing something to be born, and then seeing what needs to happen next and allowing everyone to unfold as they need to. Another like flop could also be this idea that when you design something, it has to be new. It's like some fantabulous new way of doing and thinking about something. So the lab itself isn't necessarily new. Like I had to let go of, I'm going to construct something new that doesn't exist, and realize that what's available to me is more, how can I bring people together in a way maybe they haven't been connecting before? Or what are the subtle different things that I can bring to the conversation? So for example, I've decided to really just hone in on a particular group of people, design leaders and agents of change, or people who are leading change processes, rather than everybody who's in a leadership role. You know, maybe I just hone in on that group of people. That's the real discovery of what the lab has to offer. Yes, I'm just trying to think of any other really big flops that I can. It's hard for me to think about a big flop, because every time I have a disappointment, I am by nature going to say, what did I learn from that? Because otherwise it's too painful. I don't know if it's particularly helpful.
No, I think it's good. It was just a curiosity for me.
Yeah.
So you sent me a little paragraph before we talked, and there were a couple things in here that I just wanted to read to you and ask you to unpack. Some of it you already have, but there's a few things in here that, well, you know, really interesting to me. So let me just say, let me just read this. It's your words. Intersubjective power patterns, very interesting. That was my words. Dysregulating individual and collective trauma. We talked about that. And a lack of shared meta-ontology. You talked about that a little bit too, but I'd love to know a little more about that. Are the usual culprits casting shadows on all that occludes our ability to lead with others in these liminal times? I mean, intersubjective power patterns are so fascinating. How do you uncover them, disclose them, learn about them? How does one do that? And how are you doing that?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So the person who's the real specialist in this domain is Hilary Bradbury, who's like an action research luminary. As I said, she's kind of part of that Bill Torbert lineage. She's the founder of Action Research Plus. She's the editor and founder of the Action Research Journal, which is a SAGE publication. And you know, she's developed this work at the intersection of adult development and power patterns. Sometimes she calls it, does she call it math and love, or power and love? I'm not quite sure, but she's taken, because she's one of the guest facilitators in our program, she takes us through this process of coding scripts that we've drawn from our life experience where we felt either disempowered or we felt like we were in a stuck or unhealthy power pattern. By pattern, I mean like a pattern of behavior with another person. So she was working in that sort of, not that big kind of sort of postmodern structural space around power dynamics, but more in the between you and I, what's going on and how is that constraining creative collaboration. And so she really had us reflect on moments in our lives where, when did we feel either diminished, or we felt like we were hovering over, or maybe we felt like there was a lot of mutuality. And she had us reflect on what was actually spoken. And, you know, she had this kind of Likert scale for how we'd code things in terms of, you know, was it power over, power under, power with? You know, was there positive regard present in the conversation? How much genuine curiosity was there? And starting to reflect on moments from our past to see, yeah, what was present in the relationship? What was going on there that we weren't paying attention to, we were just reacting to in the moment? And starting to look at the part we play, the part we as individuals are playing, and also the intent we bring to how we are in relationship with others. Again, this is like, what's your intent? And then based on that intent, where are you placing your attention? So when you go into that relational space, what is your attention on? You know, are you listening to the motivations behind people's behaviors? How are you relating to yourself and others to sort of see more of a balcony view while you're in the moment with other people? How can you slow things down for yourself and start paying attention? So she really takes us through a process around that, what she calls reflexive practice, making visible that which we cannot see that's going on in the space between us, codifying it, making it like, bringing like scientific rigor to it as part of the practice. And then, yeah, just bringing that personal commitment and intent to, I am learning all the time. I am on a journey of discovery about, you know, how to work with others in a more creative and collaborative way. Yeah, so it's that rigor, it's that making it visible, it's slowing down, it's sharing, as you said, talking it through with other people. And then it's taking action, taking different action.
Little new moves. Yeah.
New moves. And there's lots of people doing work in the space, you know, there's the nonviolent communication and yeah, there's other relational inquiry work. And I know, you know, Bill Torbert's doing that work as well. And it's, I mean, even in my life partner relationship, I have to constantly bring that sort of rigor and vigilance, because we're very, you know, we could easily polarize both in our personality structures and how we interface with the world. So it takes that, like, what's going on here, with like genuine curiosity, not like in the kind of Woody Allen way where you're like, what's going on here, but more in a genuinely relaxed, curious, what is going on here? And bringing that sort of background state of inquiry into the relational field. It sounds like it's exhausting, but it's actually very peaceful.
Yeah, it is peaceful. I have noticed it is one thing to understand about relational inquiry and another thing to actually create the conditions for it to happen. This is an experiment we've actually been running this experiment on the Huddle. I talked to Bill Torbert about this when I interviewed him. Is you know, it's, you know, that's where I feel I've maybe, I don't know if I would call them face plants or, you know, just failed experiments. Not really, because they kind of worked. I'm not really sure. We sort of muddled through it. We had some relational inquiry, but I just noticed that it is, you know, when you're having a conversation with a group of people and you're really trying to inquire and be present to what's emerging in the moment, and go deeper than the sort of easily downloadable, superficial. I mean, it doesn't, it's not that it's even superficial, but it's just, there's sort of like an ordinary conversation that we're all caught up in a lot of the time. And then there's something deeper that I think a lot of us would like to create in our lives, like you said, in our partnerships, in line at Starbucks, you know, wherever. It would be more interesting to live life like that. And I just find, you know, I just find myself frustrated a lot of the times when I try to create it. So I don't know, how would you mirror back to me on that? What would you say about that?
Yeah, no, I would say, like, there's lots of different things I could say. We could, you know, let's
Yeah.
look at this through the developmental like lens. It sounds like I'm trying to create it. It sounds like you're trying to create, you know, relational
Yeah.
inquiry, like this high achieving, I need to produce this outcome, right? It's kind of like you got to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
willing to
sure.
set the intention and let go of the outcome and see what
Yeah.
arises. I think there's something about, you know, how do you create safety in group space? What does that
Mm-hmm.
look like? What are the conditions for safety? People won't go. So I do have a background as a counselor. People will not go with you if they don't feel like you're already there or
Mm-hmm.
that the space is safe. They just won't go where they feel like they can't be held.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, it's if I'm the leader or the facilitator of the space, it's like I have to really have my attention on where am I right now? Like, how am I showing up? How am I being? Am I genuinely curious? You
Mm-hmm.
know, am I regulated in my own nervous system? Am I paying attention to what happens in the space when I get thrown off? What's my response when I get thrown off? How do I, you know, and also being very aware that people who are there, they're there because they care. Like sometimes um, an individual in the space that comes across as being a challenge, you just have to reframe it like that challenge is because they care so much. So how do I work with how much that person cares and acknowledges how much they care to bring them in to a deepened, more trustful space, and just to have that intention of, am I, you know, what am I attached to here? What am I willing to let go of? And you know, sometimes it could just be I'm willing for it to be a flop, even though everything about my structure is I need to look good. It's like
Yeah.
what am I bringing into the space that's going to have an impact?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. We were willing for it to be a flop.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it helped. And you're right, that did help.
Right.
Okay. Anything you want to say about your why, like why you are doing this as opposed to, I don't know, something else, you know?
Mm. Well, as I said, my sort of very deeply personal why is around having my work in the world be a contribution to the alleviation of needless suffering for all life everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I am, you know, 50 years old. I have a lot of embodied wisdom. I
Mm-hmm.
have a very eclectic background, and I'm committed to bringing my full self in service um, to that deep stand. And you know, there's a lot of creativity in my background as well, and there's a lot of design in my background. So, you know, how do I bring that all together to make that offer available to those who I feel like could use some support, where I already have a bit of shared understanding and a shared language. Um, and then for the lab itself, it's this piece around, you know, what I opened the conversation with is I believe firmly I could be wrong, and I'm willing to be wrong, but I believe that we're at a time where we need our as many people as possible to have a more mature, more nuanced, and more embodied, or at least access to that intelligence, so that we can respond masterfully to the current current scenario, to the current ecosocial crisis. So I want my life to be a contribution to that in the way where my gifts and strengths and talents can actually make a difference. And as I said, if it's just about creating safe spaces for learning to happen so that people can go off and share their discovery and be kinder, more compassionate with themselves and others, I'm willing for that to be enough.
Yeah, great. Is that part of the origin myth behind your work, or what is the origin myth behind your work?
Well, the origin myth behind Transition Leadership Lab was, as I said, I spent 3 years doing research on that question: how might we design learning experiences for practitioners that enhances our reflexivity so that we may lead masterfully with others in this, these VUCA conditions. And as I said, there was no unicorn discoveries, just insight that this group of people of design, leadership, and change practitioners could use a safe sandbox to play in. That the way forward, particularly if you start from a design orientation, is to transcend and include design. We need to draw from complexity science, leadership science, psychology, adult development, integral. We need to be embodiment, arts practice. We need to be drawing from everything. Throw it all on the table. Let's build it and see what works. That's my idea. And that piece around learning happens with others. So out of that, I reached out to the program where I did my master's to see if the coordinator of that program would be willing to allow those current students in that program to receive partner elective credits if they completed Transition Leadership Lab. And, after a bit of benchmarking and rubrics and completion standards and so forth, that was given a go-ahead, a green light. So I was like, well, what am I going to do? Spend 3 years thinking about something without actually, building something practical out of it. So let's build something. And that's what I did. And I had input from lots of different people, including Hillary Bradbury and Lisa Norton, I've mentioned her earlier, and Kieran Murray and Dana Carman. They all sort of contributed to the design and have been guest facilitators. And so we've been leading that lab since 2021, and we've been doing 2 a year. The next one is in July, starts July 18th. And as I said earlier, it is a space where people can do this sort of from what to what, from the inside out, but they also come out with a testable experiment. They come out of the journey with something practical that they're going to build in the world after they've done all that work on themselves first to see if the theory does translate into something applicable around transitioning from what to what. And then their next iteration is, what am I going to do with this out in the world? What am I going to build and develop? So everyone comes out with something, a project or an experiment that they're going to keep developing over time, including myself, which the ongoing experiment is the lab. It's like, how can I make this better? How can I tweak this? How can I shift this? What do we need to let go of? What do we need to keep? And constantly learning from the people who come, because everyone's bringing so much knowledge and experience with them. And also for me, it was like, I'm lonely. I need to learn with others, right? That was the big discovery. It's relational. So it was like, let's bring people together to learn together, including me. I'm facilitating and I'm learning at the same time. And I make that very transparent up front.
So great. Cool. And so if people are interested, we'll put the links in the notes below the video, whatever that's called. I'm learning this thing called YouTube, whatever it is, but anyway, we will put it all there. And they would, what are the deadlines for them to get involved? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have 2 tranches of applications. The program is by application. So the process is, if people are interested, they click the apply now button on the webpage. They fill out an expression of interest form. They schedule a discovery session with me, because I like to have every touch point. I am a designer after all. Every touch point in the experience provide value for them and provide value for me. So I take 45 minutes to talk to each person who's interested to see if it's the right match. Hopefully they get value out of that conversation. Hopefully I do too. And then if we agree that it's the right match, they progress towards completing an application. And the first tranche is due beginning of June. the second tranche is due beginning of July. So yeah, and then I review each tranche to see how many people will come in through that pathway. And we only take a maximum of 10 people in one cohort, so we keep it really small and intimate.
Oh, that sounds cozy and
yeah,
really fun. Yeah, cool. Cool. Well, anything else we need to know? Anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, just that I'm really grateful, Justin, that you did say yes, because I did reach out to you, and then I reached out again, or maybe you reached out to me. And so I'm really glad you shared that with me. And I'm really grateful that you've said yes and I've said yes, and I have this opportunity to just reconnect with you. I really enjoy you, and also to be introduced to your community in this way. That's very generous. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, and it's my pleasure. And I'm really grateful too. And I love you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, cool. So, okay, well, thank you so much.